pleasant evening out here in the futuristic city with all these air cars, flying cars around me. Welcome to another Down the Rabbit Hole video. We're doing a Star Frontiers video, kind of. It's actually just broadly science fiction, but it does beg the question, how did you manage this in your campaign? Because I wanted to talk about these things flying overhead. I want to discuss the reality of flying cars. They are problematic. They look great in science fiction, and we've seen them a million times, but how do you actually make that work? And how do you make that actually work in your Star Frontiers campaign? Now, when I'm talking flying cars, in Star Frontiers they are divvied up. There are both flying cars, a la Blade Runner, the spinner, the things you see above me here. There are also hover cars, which are more like Luke's land speeder. And having talked about my Kenner Luke's land speeder not too long ago, I thought, yeah, I'm in a really good timing here to discuss the reality of flying cars. Because I always thought from early in my Star Frontiers campaign, that wouldn't work. Now, it's interesting to note the real reality of actual flying cars is with us in the modern era and has been dabbled with for decades. So real actual flying cars are a thing. But when I was a kid watching Blade Runner and various other shows, I would think to myself, well, that's really cool, you know, Deckard's up there doing his thing and there's spinners going off and doing what have you. And yeah, sure, that's great. But what is propelling that? Is it like a giant helicopter blade underneath? Is it some kind of magical anti-gravity shell that it's sitting on? How are these flying cars flying? Because it's gonna actually relate in Star Frontiers. There's gonna be scenarios. The nice thing about any pen and paper role-playing game is sometimes you have to really think, how is this exactly working? In the case of fantasy, it's no big problem. You know, magic, blah, 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 wizards and demons, and you can explain anything with a wish, a magic wand, what have you, because the story needs to propel forward. And in Star Frontiers, there are obviously certain things that I was just like glossing over because we have to tell some kind of science fiction story. But there will come into your campaign scenarios where suddenly someone uses a flying car in a way that you might have to think, oh, how would that work? And in fact, I've got a Star Wars example, but let me get there first. So, hover cars, land speeder. The very notion is and I think it's in the write-up for the hover car. If not, I've certainly heard it in various science fiction formats before. If you can have a vehicle hovering above some kind of pocket of air where there's no friction, it never comes into contact with the ground, that thing will fly. And in fact, we have hover cars, those things that the Coast Guard use that they're kind of inflated and just going over the water. I think they can pull up on a beach. Those things, that's a hover car. And it is true, they can really barrel along the surface of the water or the beach or what have you. Might be a problem if they're in traffic. Has anyone ever driven one of those on cement? I don't know. I didn't look it up before doing this video. But the concept is valid. If you can suspend the vehicle above a pocket of air somehow, you will get major speed. I don't know how you're going to hit the brakes. I won't get into that. So in Star Frontiers, there are hover cars. And they do describe some of the technology. And in fact, there's also hover bikes, little asterisk on that for a second. Hover bikes, which are also showing this. I've seen artwork showing a hover bike in the TSR, like either in Dragon Magazine or in one of the articles in Alpha Dawn. Like the hover bike and the hover car have these giant fan blades underneath, and I'm like, right. So it's some kind of a helicopter idea. That's what we're going with here, which is fine. But then you run into problems. So to use my Star Wars example, I've already mentioned Luke's land speeder, but in The Phantom Menace, Qui-Gon Jinn is running like mad because one of those big droid troop transports that hovers over the ground, the big, can't remember the name of it, but this vehicle here, and as you can see, it's hovering. It's slowly rolling over some kind of pocket of air, one would assume. These things, he's got one right behind him and he's running, and Jar Jar Binks is like, oh, what's going on? And Qui-Gon is like, get out of the way, get out of the way. And what he does is he grabs him and he drops to the ground, and that thing floats over the top of them. And that's the moment that made me suddenly think, how's that going to work? Because if that is, never mind the size of that giant vehicle, but any big vehicle, if it's got like a helicopter level of pressure, of air pushing down to keep it afloat, Qui-Gon and Jar Jar are going to be pulverized. But they roll out from underneath it at the end. They're like, oh, wasn't that fun? And it's like, okay, so that's not exactly what Star Frontiers is going for. We're not grounding it in a deep level of reality. Also, early Star Wars, like not just Luke's Landspeeder, but like you do see quite often the X-Wings just sort of magically float up and then they take off. And it's like, okay, what's causing that? Is that like, you know, the vertical takeoff landing capability of the Harrier? Is that what the X-Wing is? There's a lot of sound of engines blowing and stuff. But you don't see like a lot of air being dispersed. So whatever it was that the X-Wings were using to take off and launch into the movie was like, okay, well, we can infer that Star Wars has some kind of, like Luke's Landspeeder, some kind of magical anti-gravity thing that it sits on top of. Fine. In Star Frontiers, do you have that? And if you do, are you using that magical anti-gravity bubble thing anywhere else? Because I always loved, and I've done a video about this before, in Star Frontiers they explain a lot of things with a great grounding in science. The decks of the ships are all, if the ship is going that way, the decks are that way. Not like the Millennium Falcon or the Enterprise where it's like the ship is going that way and the decks are that way. No. They're going up and the decks are that way because it'll accelerate and push and force gravity. I loved that mechanic. And by the same token, I'm like, well, if you got this magical bubble of anti-gravity that these vehicles are riding on and Qui-Gon and Jar Jar can just roll out from underneath it, if you're doing that in your Star Frontiers campaign, if that's how you explain hover cars and air cars, why don't you just have artificial gravity then? Just reverse the polarity of whatever that little magical bubble of anti-gravity is, and you don't need to follow the other levels of science of the campaign. You know what I mean? So, with that in mind, I thought to myself, okay, I want to think through how are air cars and hover cars, how are they working in Star Frontiers? For me, it was a really loud push down of air. And again, loud is a factor. We have flying cars today. We actually have them. I did a little Google search on YouTube and stuff before doing this video. Yeah, actual hover cars exist today. Now there are fairly recent ones like the Jetson A, I believe it's called, which is essentially a quadcopter drone, but it's big enough to hold a person. Fine. It operates like a car, like an air car. It flies. The people who are building that thing have got a little promotional video. Guy gets into his flying car and he flies over a couple of orchards to his neighbor's house and gets a drink or whatever. And it's like, okay. That thing's got to be loud as heck though. And that's going to be a factor in your campaign. If you've got to shout at the top of your lungs to be heard over the sound of these whirring engines, that's something to consider. I mean, Qui-Gon is easily able to yell to Jar Jar, get out of the way, and be heard. And that's with the magical bubble thing I talked about earlier. I also checked out, there is another collection of videos of air cars, flying cars, that actually exist. I'm going to put a link below. There's a really great video. Various attempts at flying cars over the decades. And they are all really loud. So you're going to run into audio sound problems. Never mind getting squashed underneath one from all the pressure of the air pushing down. You're going to have shouting at the top of your lungs to be heard over the sound of this thing. Maybe there's some kind of sci-fi futuristic muffler system. I don't know. I did pull upon a few easy explanations for things to compensate for the fact that the science is a little off. So, okay, whatever. We'll allow it in this particular case. But I thought to myself, there are so many times this trope of what you're seeing around me right now, the flying car, you just hop in and you go somewhere. It's all really cool. Yeah, that looks great, and it's something that we are actually dabbling with. In fact, I was really shocked to find out we've been dabbling with this notion since 1917. We have been actually trying to make a flying car for a century. Shock to me. Like, when I saw it in the 80s in both Return of the Jedi and also in Blade Runner, I was just like, oh, that's so futuristic. No, it's actually been something we've been dabbling with for a while. There are regulation problems up the yin-yang. And I always thought, whenever I see it's a little bit hinted in Blade Runner, but it's definitely there in The Fifth Element and the beginning of Back to the Future Part 2, the idea of, like, traffic in the sky. There are highway lanes to go by, and it's like, why would there be traffic? Why would there be highway lanes? Are there that many people with cars that can fly? And if so, what have you gained over cars that are on the ground? You're still stuck in traffic. There's still rush hour. It's still total gridlock. So I thought to myself, yeah, this is something worth addressing, because in real life we have been addressing this for a long time. Now, on the speeder bike thing from Return of the Jedi, again, that and the hover car that you see in Alpha Dawn rules, I remember thinking to myself, okay, there's a very good scene where the scout troopers are like sitting chatting in the forest, and an Ewok gets on top of one, pulls a couple of levers, and boom, he's flying down into the trees. And in the sequence, you can tell that these speeder bikes, they're always floating. They're just sitting on this magical bubble of anti-gravity. I couldn't rationalize that in Star Frontiers. I couldn't grasp what would be the thing that makes that work, because that doesn't work for me creatively. I need to have big fans lifting that thing up. And, by the way, I also found a video. There's an actual motorbike that does float. It's like, oh my god, never mind the flying cars. We've actually got flying motorcycles. This is incredible. And I just thought to myself, okay, so taking that exists in reality now, and okay, my campaign was in the 80s, and it was very futuristic back then, and your campaigns must be a weird amalgamation of like, well, this thing was made in the 80s, but we've got to modernize it, so there's things that exist now. And I'm very curious, how do you handle the reality of flying cars? Because they are very problematic, really, in like regulation, in mechanics. Like that guy flying his quadcopter thing to his neighbor's house. Apparently that thing can go up to about 60 miles per hour, but it's only good for about 20 minutes worth of flight. Okay, you know, futuristic battery power capabilities of Star Frontiers, you could rationalize away that. But it does show that there have been a lot of pitfalls already, never mind actually getting traffic up there in the sky. You just have to look at those people who own drones. They're already running into problems of like, I can't run this thing that I really love using because there are regulations. There are people telling me I can't use it here, I can't use it there, only in this spot, not in that spot. I'm getting slightly off topic, but the more I thought about flying cars and hover cars, land speeders, spinners, everything, the more I just thought, this thing that's going on around me right now, it sounds great on paper, and it works as a trope. It works as a very quick bit of, you know, you're in the futuristic world now, here's this city, and all these flying cars are around, and it's amazing, and isn't that great? Yeah. But what happens if somebody rolls underneath one like Qui-gon Jinn and Jar Jar? Are they pulverized? Do they just dust themselves off and walk away? If that kind of technology exists, then why don't you just have anti-gravity in your spaceships? You know, you're starting to get into, the more you think about it, the more I thought about it, it would unravel into a case of like, yeah, I'm having more and more problems. The more I peel away the onion of the reality of flying cars, the harder it gets to make them work in my campaign. I have a real problem with this. Regular cars, no problem. We've dealt with those for a long time, and pedal to the metal and wheels on the road, sure, no problem there. But flying cars are getting to be trouble the more I try to dismantle and examine what goes into this thing. It doesn't really work. Not very well. Anyway, I want to know how you handle the reality of flying cars in your Star Frontiers campaign. What do you guys do as far as like this thing that is just an easy tossed out little bit of science fiction trope? How do you couch the reality of it when it needs to have this pressure of air pushing down, and it's probably really, really loud, and all of the other issues that I brought up in the video? I was curious to find out. Anyway, I'm going to leave it there. That's the video for now. So that is the reality of flying cars in Star Frontiers. A real problem the more you think about it, like I did. Until next time, we'll see you down the rabbit hole.